What is up, guys? Welcome to Bardent. My name is Heinrich, and today we're finally going to start working on our new combat system. So here's just a quick demonstration of some of the weapons that we'll be making. This includes a sword, and then we also have a bow and arrow that has the ability to choose how far you want to draw the arrow back. Next we have our fists, so just a unarmed melee attack. Then we also have a knife, which is just a quick little slash attack. We also have the ability to block, but I'll demonstrate that in just a second. And we also have a magic attack. So this attack you charge up, and it charges up a bunch of like magic missiles. When you release, it'll track the closest target. And now just a quick demonstration of the shield. If we come down to our enemy 1 down here, you'll see that we can block his attacks. And then we also have the option to parry his attacks if we get the correct timing. Just like that. So now, before we get started with the system, there's just a few things that I need to explain. First of all, what is our objective? The objective is to create a system that easily allows us to create new and unique weapons for the character that are not permanently attached to the character, meaning in the future we'll give him the ability to equip and unequip different weapons. This approach also gives us the potential to maybe make our enemies be able to equip and unequip these weapons too. The next thing I need to mention is that so far the system has only been tested with animations that don't have any transition duration, so all my transition times are set to 0, but that doesn't mean it won't work if you do have transition times. I just haven't tested it. Okay, so let's talk about the system and how we're going to integrate this with our current finite state machine system that we have over here. So while we could create a separate state for each of the different weapon types that we have, so a sword attack or maybe just a melee attack, and a range attack, things like that, this will require a whole bunch of if-else statements to get to the right combat state, given that we keep track of what weapon we currently want to use. So instead, what we're going to do is make the weapon a complete separate entity to our finite state machine. What this will allow us to do is to create just a single attack state, as you can see over here. Our attack state will be a child of our ability superstate, and then what we can do is we just create a weapons class. Now, this weapons class is going to define how our attack state interacts with all the different weapons. And it essentially just boils down to an enter, exit, and logic update function like we would have in any normal state. What this allows us to do is inherit from our weapon script to create a whole variety of different weapon types. So in the demonstration, here are the scripts that we use. From our weapon, we create a defensive weapon class and an aggressive weapon class. The defensive weapon class consists of the shield and does not do damage to the enemies, and the aggressive weapon is all the other weapons that will actually do damage. From there, we can expand it even further and create click weapons and hold weapons. Click weapons are weapons that you just click once and the attack will perform. Hold weapons work slightly differently and basically just includes the logic for holding down the attack input. From there, we inherit twice more to create draw weapons and charge weapons, weapons that both rely on holding down the attack input, but have different logic to dealing with what holding the input means. In the case of the draw weapon, this will be our bow. Once we give attack input and we start drawing back the bow, we can release it at any point, and the arrow will fire with a relative strength based on how far we've drawn the bow back. As for the charge weapon, that is our magic attack, and it consists of having to fully charge up the attack first before being able to release it. And so that's basically our script structure. We have a single attack state that interacts with our weapons directly, and any weapon that inherits from weapon, our player will be able to use through the attack state. Now let's quickly talk about how we're going to deal with our animations. Seeing as we want our weapons to be completely separate game objects to our player, it makes sense that the weapon animations should live on the weapon itself and not on our player. So if we go into the final project here real quick, you can see that underneath the player, we have this weapon child game object. This just acts as a container for all of our different weapons. In the final product, all these weapons won't be here, only the weapon that we currently have equipped. But basically each of these weapons is the separate entity that I'm talking about. As you can see, we have the sword over here, and it holds the click weapon script. Now, if we expand the sword, you can see we have two child game objects. One is called attack weapon, and one is called attack player. The purpose of these two game objects is to hold two separate animations. Attack player holds the base player animation for the attack, and attack weapon holds the animation for the weapon itself. I can show you what that looks like real quick. So if I click on attack player and I open up animation and we just go to the first attack, you can see the character swings his sword like that, but there's no sword in his hand. If we then click on attack weapon and look at the first animation, you can see it's just the sword by itself. So what this is going to allow us to do is change out the sword sprite without having to change out the player's animation. But if you only have one sword type and you don't ever want to change what the sprite looks like, you can keep all of this as just a single game object. But this is the approach that I'm going to take. As you can see, when we play the first attack animation, we still have our character just standing here. So how are we going to deal with this? Essentially what we end up having is we have a bunch of separate animators. Our player has its core animator that just has all of these movement and different animations that we require. And then our weapon itself, if we open up our sword again, you can see we have smaller animators just for the attack patterns of the weapon. What you'll notice is I have this animation state called empty. And if I click on my player, you can see it's up here as well. What this is it's simply an animation state that holds an animation called empty. And if we take a look at this animation, you can see it just has one frame, and this one frame is just a transparent sprite. It doesn't have any pixels. And so what that means is when our player transitions into the empty state, his sprite disappears. If we look at our sprite renderer, the sprite over here is just a blank sprite. So what we do when we attack, we transition to this empty state. As you can see, our condition is attack equals true. We transition to this empty state, and at the same time on our weapon, we transition out of the empty state and start playing these animations. This allows us to layer these separate animators without them interfering with each other in the actual game. If we go ahead and run the game real quick, and we just start an attack and pause it. I don't know if I can actually do that. There we go. As you can see, we're mid-swing, and if we look at our sword, bring up the animator over here, you can see we're about almost done with the last animation here. On the weapon, it's on the same animation state. And if we take a look at our player, you can see we are empty. If you look at the sprite renderer, it's currently showing player movement _ 70. Now this is actually just an empty frame. If we go ahead and look at our sprites, come to player movement, you can see it's this frame over here. Player movement 70, so it's just an empty block of our animation. So this allows us to seamlessly transition between different animators and show the animations on our weapon instead. This means that each of our weapons can have unique animator transition logic. So if we look at our sword, we have these 3 attack animations. Our fists, they have 4, and our bow has completely separate logic. And all of this logic is controlled by our weapon script, which means that we could potentially have an endless variety of attack patterns on different weapons. So yeah, that is the gist of how the system is going to work based on actually creating the weapons and animations. We'll cover how we're going to deal damage and things like that down the line. Just know that we're going to be using interfaces for that. But we'll cover that once we get to it. So this system is quite complex. Don't feel bad if you don't quite understand what's happening yet. I'll make sure to go through it real slow. But with that being said, we can go ahead and get started. Okay, so here we are where we left off in the last episode with the crouching ability. Boop, boop. There we go. Okay, so to get started, let's just go ahead and create our attack state. So we'll come to scripts, player states, and then substates. So just go ahead and right click, create new C# script, and we'll just call it player attack state. We can then go ahead and open that up. So you'll notice that my Visual Studio looks a little bit different, and that is just because I now have this Solution Explorer open on the left side. This just allows us to quickly change between scripts without having to tab back to Unity. If you want to open it up for yourself, just come up here to search and search Solution Explorer, and then just go ahead and click on that and it should open it up. You can drag it around and dock it wherever you want. I like having it on the left over here. Anyway, to start off with, let's go ahead and get rid of this pre-generated code and make it inherit from our player ability state. The reason we inherit from our player ability state is because it's basically just like every other ability. Once the attack is done, we just say ability done, and then our player ability state can take care of transitioning back to any other state that we need to be in. We can then go ahead and just right click on our player attack state, say quick actions and refactoring, and generate our constructor. Now before we do anything else in this state, let's come over to our player script and open up our state variables. and let's create the instance of our player attack state. Now, we're actually going to have two instances of our player attack state, and the reason for this is we're going to map each one of those states to the corresponding input. So we're going to have a primary attack and a secondary attack. Let me show you what I mean. Just go ahead and declare a public player attack state, and we'll call it primary attack state. Don't forget to give it the getter and the private setter. And next we have another public player attack state, this time called secondary attack state. And this should be primary. So once we've declared these two variables, we can go ahead and close this region and come to our Unity callbacks and just add them in here. So we'll say that our primary attack state equals a new player attack state with this as our player, state machine as our state machine, player data as our player data, and then finally for our animation boolean name, we're just going to call it attack. Now we don't need to call this primary attack or anything like that. That's because both of these attack states are going to transition to the same animation. So let's just go ahead and copy this and paste it down here. And we'll change this to our secondary attack state. Next, let's go ahead and set up the input for our combat. So let's go back to Unity and we'll navigate to our player input folder over here and open up our player input actions asset. Let's come over to our actions column and hit the plus icon over here, and we'll just create a primary attack input. So primary attack, and let's go ahead and create another one called secondary attack. Now for keyboard and mouse, the mapping is just going to be left click and right click, left click being for primary attack. So let's click on this no binding and select keyboard as our control scheme. And then for path, we'll come and select mouse and choose the left mouse button. We can then come to our secondary binding, hit keyboard, come back to the path, and this time select the right mouse button. Now on my controller, I want to use the X and Y button on my Xbox controller. So for primary attack, let's go ahead and add a binding. And this time we'll select gamepad, and then click on path, hit listen, turn on your controller, and hit X. So in this case, it's button west. Let's do the same for our secondary attack. Hit add binding, gamepad, listen, and my secondary attack, I'm going to make Y, or the north button. Now, if we just go ahead and look at our dash, I think one of these is already using button west. So I'm going to rebind this to something else. I think I'll make it right bumper. So right shoulder. So that's basically all we need to do in terms of our input actions asset. Let's go ahead and open up our input handler. So let's come down to our input event functions, and just at the top, let's create two new event functions for each of our inputs. So we'll have a public void on primary attack input. And don't forget input action.callbackContext called context as our input parameter. And then before we do anything in there, let's go ahead and create the other one. So public void on secondary attack input. And again, we need the input action.callbackContext called context. Like that. Now, before we can do anything in here, we need to create our variable that's going to store our input. And we're going to do this slightly different to the rest of our input. Instead of having just a bool for primary and a bool for secondary, we're going to create an array of booleans, and you'll see why in just a second. So go ahead and declare a public bool and make sure it's an array and just call it attack inputs. And then don't forget to give it the public getter and the private setter. Now what we want to do is we want to map our primary attack input to the 0th element of our attack input and our secondary input to the first element of our attack inputs. Now, just to make sure that we can keep track of this a little bit better, instead of directly assigning the numbers, we're going to create an enum to keep track of which attack input we're using. So let's just go ahead and scroll down to the bottom of the class, and outside of the class, so after our last closing squiggly bracket, go ahead and declare a public enum, and we'll just call it combat inputs, like that. Now in here we can define any inputs that we want, and we just have a primary input and a secondary input. Now why are we doing this? It's just because if we hover over primary, you can see that primary has been assigned the value 0 and secondary has been assigned the value 1. This means that anywhere else in our scripts we can reference combat inputs.primary and know exactly which index it has to be. So if we end up changing this name or adding different things in here, the index will stay the same across everywhere. Otherwise, if we were to just use 0 here and we want to read in input 0 from somewhere else, and then suddenly we change our primary input to 1, we have to go through and find all those places where we use it and change it there as well. Okay, so we have these two enums. What we need to do now is make sure that our combat or our attack inputs array is the same size as the amount of enums that we have. And to do this is really simple. We'll just come to our start function, and in here we'll just create an integer called count. This is going to be the count or the amount of enums that we have. And to get that, we're going to make use of this enum. It's enum with a capital E. As you'll see, it'll give us a warning, which means this just doesn't exist currently. But what we can do is click on it, click Control full stop, and you can see that it's recommending that we include using system. If we hit that, you'll see using system has been added up here, and now we have access to enum. So we say enum.getValues, and this is just going to get all the enums from our enumerator that we pass it. And to this, we just pass type of, and we give it our combat inputs, like that. So this is going to return an array. So after this, we just say dot length, and this should return 2. If you debug it, you'll see that count equals 2 because we have 2 enums. So now that we know how many enums we have, we can just go ahead and say attack inputs equals a new Boolean array, and the size of this Boolean array is count. Perfect. Now let's go ahead and come to our onPrimary attack input, and in here we'll just say if context.started. So the first frame where we push down our attack input, we're just going to set the bool equal to true. So attack inputs square bracket. And now, like I mentioned, instead of just saying 0, we're going to say combat inputs dot primary. But combat inputs.primary returns the enum and does not return the actual number. So all we need to do is just cast this as an int. Perfect. So combat inputs.primary returns primary, cast it to an int, returns 0. So once we have that, we just set this equal to true. Perfect. Now we'll come and say if context.cancelled. So this is the frame, or the last frame where our attack input is active. We're just going to set that same Boolean back to false. So attack inputs square bracket, cast it as an int, combat inputs dot primary equals false. Now we're going to do the exact same thing in our secondary attack input. So let's just go ahead and copy and paste this in here. And instead of primary, now we just have secondary. So now that we have our event handler functions, let's go ahead and come back to Unity and click on our player, and let's just hook up everything there before we move on to anything else. So if we click on our player, and just over here we have our player input component. Go ahead and open up our events, open up gameplay, and as you can see here we have primary attack and secondary attack. So let's go ahead and add to our primary attack list, drag in our player input handler, and select the function under player input handler on primary attack input. And now just go ahead and do the same for secondary. So add to the list, player input handler, and the function we're calling is our on secondary attack input. And yeah, there we go. Now our input has been hooked up. Let's go ahead and set up some transitions to our attack state just to make sure everything is working the way we think it is. So let's go ahead and come back to our scripts. And let's start by adding a transition from our grounded state to our attack state. So we'll come to our player states, super states, and open up our player grounded state. Let's go ahead and scroll down to our logic update function, and here you can see our current transitions. Let's go ahead and add our attack input at the very top, so it takes precedence over anything else. We'll just go ahead and say if our player.inputHandler.attackInputs. So this is now referencing that Boolean array that we created. We need to specify which index we want, and we're going to look at our primary attack input first. So open up some square brackets, cast as an int, and call our combat inputs dot primary. Let's go ahead and open up the body of this if statement. And in here, all we need to say is state machine dot change state to our player dot primary attack state. Just like that. Now we'll also add our else if, and this time we'll check for our secondary attack input. So player dot input handler dot attack inputs, and this time we're casting as an int combat inputs dot secondary. And this time it's just state machine dot change state to our player dot secondary attack state. Just like that. And now don't forget to add an else before this if, because we don't want to be able to transition twice. Now we also need these same transitions from our player in air state. So just go ahead and copy this, and then open up our substates folder, come to our player in air state, and we'll just add it at the same spot. So at the beginning of all the other transitions. So just like that, and then add an else if here. Now, one thing that we still need to add to our player grounded state is, remember, we just added our crouching ability. Now, all of our attacks require the character to be standing up, so we don't want to be able to attack once we're stuck in a little hole, like with our dash and stuff like that. So let's just go ahead and add some conditions to our if statement. So we'll just say and not is touching ceiling, and just go ahead and add it to this one as well. So and not is touching ceiling. Perfect, just like that. Let's go ahead and test this out. So let's come to Unity, go ahead and hit run. And now if we left click, you can see our character just kind of freezes because we're kind of stuck in a state that doesn't really exist yet, but you can see it prints out attack. So that's working. Let's test our right click or our secondary attack. Does the same thing. Perfect. Let's move on. Next, we're going to change something in our player input handler. Now, this doesn't have anything to do with the combat, but you know, when you get a chance to clean up some of your code, it's a good idea to do it. So if we come to our on movement input, we have all of this unnecessary code here to set our X and Y inputs. We can go ahead and delete this whole if else statement and simply replace it with normalized input X equals mathf dot round to int. And to this, we just pass our raw movement input dot X. So what this is going to do is it looks at raw movement input dot X. If it's greater than 0.5, it spits out 1. If it's less than 0.5, it spits out 0. That's essentially exactly what this code is doing. Now, obviously, if you want this threshold to be higher than 0.5, you won't be able to use this. But if you're just doing 0.5 like me, you can go ahead and replace, you know, that 8 to 10 lines of code with just this. So we'll say normalized input Y equals mathf dot round to int raw movement input dot Y. And we can get rid of all of this. Perfect. Okay, so now that that's clean, I'm happy again. And I bet you are too. Next, we can go ahead and import all of our sprites. So let's come back to Unity. And you should be able to find all of these sprites in the description. So we'll come to our sprites folder, player, and let's just go ahead and do some organization here real quick. Let's go ahead and create a new folder, and we'll just call it movement. And go ahead and put these two sprites in there, and then create another folder that we'll just call combat. Let's go ahead and open this up, and now we can import all of our sprites. So let's take a look at the sprites real quick. You'll see we have two folders here. One is called base and one is called weapon1. If we go ahead and open up the base, you'll see we have a bunch of different sprite sheets. these are all separate sprite sheets of each attack. So each attack of each weapon has its own sprite sheet, and that just makes it easier for us to find the sprites that we're looking for when we're setting up the attack, instead of having one huge sprite sheet with all the attacks in it. Now, this is going to create one small issue for us, but I'll show you how to fix that in just a second. Let's go ahead and start with our base animations. Just select all of them and import them. As you can see, we have all of them here now. We can go ahead and select all of them and change our settings. So we need to change our pixels per unit to 16 and our sprite mode to multiple. We can then come down and change our filter mode to point no filter and set our compression to none and then hit apply. Now here's the problem. We have about 20 different sprite sheets here, and I really don't feel like going into each one, clicking on sprite editor, coming up to slice, setting the type to grid by cell size, 64 by 64, hitting slice, hitting apply, and then doing that for each of them. That just seems like a loss. So instead, we're going to use a custom little editor tool that I just found on Stack Exchange or on the Unity forum somewhere, I don't know, but the code will be in the description, and we're just going to go ahead and copy and paste it. We don't need to understand it just now. It's just going to make our lives a little bit easier. So what we need to do is come to our assets folder and create a new folder called editor. In this folder, we can then go ahead and create a new C# script, and we're just going to call it editor helper. So let's go ahead and open that up and just get rid of everything. So now just go ahead and copy and paste the code that I provided in the description in here. It basically just goes to a specific folder, looks at all the sprite sheets there, and slices them based on a specific width and height. So over here you can set your width and height. We want 64 by 64. And over here you can set where you want your pivot to be. In my case, all this can just be left as default. So basically what we need to do now is come back to Unity, come to our assets folder once again, and then create a new folder called resources. Inside of this folder, we'll create another folder, and this one will be called toSlice. Like this, it's very important that the spelling is exactly the same. So capital T, O, and capital S. Next, let's go ahead and come back to our sprites. So combat, we have all of these. Go ahead and select all of them, and then just drag them to our toSlice folder. So now if we come up here to this new tab that's been added, this editor helper, click that and hit slice sprites. You can see it went through all the sprites in our toSlice folder and sliced it. It's all here now. Perfect. So let's just go ahead and select all of them again, and let's drag them back to our sprites folder. So in combat. Now we actually want to come into combat and create a new folder, and we'll just call it base. And then select all the sprites and throw them in there. So now that we have all of our base sprites done, let's come back and take a look at our first weapon. Well, these are all the first weapons for each one of our different weapon types. Go ahead and select all of those and import them. Let's move them to our toSlice folder. So now that they're all here, go ahead and select all of them again. Change our pixels per unit to 16, the sprite mode to multiple, filter mode to point no filter, and our compression to none, and hit apply. And now to slice all of them, we come back to our editor helper, slice sprites. And there we go, all of our sprites have been sliced. So now let's go back to our combat folder. Let's just go ahead and create our new folder called weapon1. And let's drag all of our sprites in there. So from toSlice, select all, and drag into weapon1. And there we go, that's all of our sprites imported. Okay, so now that we have all of our sprites imported, let's go ahead and get started on the weapon architecture. So on our player game object, let's go ahead and create a new empty game object. We'll just call that weapons, like that. And then underneath this, we can create another child, and we'll just start off with our sword. So we'll create a game object called sword1. And then you guessed it, under this, let's go ahead and create another child. This one we'll just call base. And then under sword1 create another empty child. And this one will just be called weapon. You'll notice that the names are slightly different than the example at the beginning of the video, but I just think that this naming is going to be a little bit better. So let's go ahead and add the components that we need on these game objects. Well, the ones that we have available to us. So both our weapon and our base are going to need sprite renderers. They will then also need animators. Now our sword1 game object needs to have our weapon script on it, but we don't have that yet. So let's go ahead and create that. Let's come to our scripts folder over here, and let's create a new folder, call it weapons. And then inside of that, let's go ahead and create a new C# script, and we'll just call it weapon. So let's go ahead and open that up. And we can just start off by getting rid of this pre-generated code. Now we're not actually going to do anything in here yet. I just want to have it ready for us to use in just a second. Let's come back to Unity, click on our sword1 and add our weapon script. Before we really want to move on with this, let's go ahead and get our animation set up. So let's come to our animation folder, and before we create our animations, we're going to need our Animator Controllers. So let's go to this folder, and let's just do some organizing. We'll start off by creating a new folder called player, and into this we can drag our player and our old player ACs. Let's go ahead and create another folder called enemies, and then we can drag our dummy, enemy1 and enemy2 into that. Finally, let's create one last folder called particles and drag our particle AC into that. Now let's go ahead and create another folder called combat. And then inside of this folder, let's create two more folders. One is going to be called base and one is going to be called weapon. Inside of our base folder, let's go ahead and create a new animator controller. And this will just call our base sword animator controller. So base underscore sword underscore AC. So our base sword animator controller. We can then come to our weapons folder, create another animator controller, and this will be our weapon underscore sword underscore AC. Now that we have these two controllers, let's just go ahead and add them to our game object. So we'll start with our weapon, drag on our weapon sword AC, which goes over here, and then click on base, come to our base folder, and drag this on there. Perfect, now we're ready to start actually making the animations. So let's come back to our animation folder and head into our animations folder. Let's go ahead and create a new folder. We'll just call it particles, just to keep this organized. Then create another folder called combat. Inside of this, we can then go ahead and create two more folders. One is going to be called base, and one is going to be called weapon. Now, inside of this, just for organization, we're going to create more folders, one for each weapon. So we're starting off with our sword. So sword, and then let's come to our base folder, create another folder called sword. There we go. Let's start by creating our base animations. So we can come to our animation tab, click on our base game object, and create a new animation clip. So turns out we're in the correct directory. So animation, animations, combat, base. Actually, no, we need to go into our sword folder. So our naming convention for this is going to be base, because it's our base attack animation, underscore our weapon sword, and then underscore the number of the attack. So we start off with attack 1. Go ahead and change the sample rate to 15. And before we add any sprites, let's go ahead and create the other two animations as well. So create new clip. It's going to be the same, but this time it's underscore 2. Change this to 15. And let's create the last one. So create new clip, base, click on this, change that to 3. And then let's come and change our samples to 15. And now again, before we add any of our frames, let's just go ahead and do the same for our weapon. So click on weapon, create a new animation clip, navigate to the weapon sword folder. And this time the naming convention is weapon underscore sword underscore 1. Change the sample rate to 15 and then create the other two clips. So sword 2. Actually, I made a little mistake. This should be sword 1 underscore 2 because it's our first sword sprite. Go ahead and save that. We can come and change the other one real quick. So come to weapon, sword, and let's just rename this like that. Okay. Don't forget to change the sample rate to 15, and then let's create the final animation clip. So click on weapon again, create new clip, and our final animation clip is going to be underscore 3, like that. Change the sample rate to 15, and now we're ready to start adding our sprites. So again, let's start with our weapon base. We're on our base underscore sword 1. Let's navigate to our sprites folder. So sprites, player, combat, base. Let's go ahead and find our sword animations. So sword 1. Go ahead and select all of these and just drag them on there. If we come and click play, you can see we don't see anything. And that is because our two game object sprite renderers are still on the wrong sorting layer. So let's go ahead and select both of those. Take a look at the sprite renderer, change the sorting layer to player. And in this case, our ordering layer for the base needs to be 1. And the weapon needs to be 2. So now if we try this out, there we go. We can see our little dude swinging his sword. We'll be fixing animation timing and stuff like that when we start adding our damage and things like that. For now, this is fine. Let's go to our second animation, open up our second sprite sheet, drag that in, check it out. Perfect. Now finally we have our third animation. Go ahead and drag all those in. Perfect. Okay. Now go ahead and click on the weapon game object. Let's navigate to the weapon animations. So weapon 1. Here we have this. Okay. Go ahead and select all these sprites, drag them in. There you can see the sword. Perfect. And then next we have our second animation. So just go ahead and drag those in. Whoops. And then finally our last animation. So as you can see, it's quite a bunch of setup work, but I promise that the results are worth it. Now that we have all these animations created, we're basically ready to start creating the transitions. We're just missing one animation, and that is our empty animation. So let's go ahead and get an empty sprite. Let's just come to our movement folder, player movement, sprite editor. Now it doesn't have to be the sprite sheet. You could literally use any sprite sheet you want. You could just have a plain PNG with nothing in it imported, but this is how I'm going to do it. Just select a random block. The size doesn't matter, but just so it looks better, I'm going to make it 64 by 64. And then let's move it somewhere nice and out of the way. Go ahead and hit apply. Now actually I'm going to click on it and just change its name to empty. That way when we're looking for it, it'll show up. Let's go ahead and create our empty state on our player animator first. So we'll click on player and let's create a new animation clip. And our empty animation, we're just going to put directly in our animations folder because it's going to be reused by a bunch of different things. So we'll just call it empty, like that. The sample rate doesn't matter. And now we can just search for empty. And there we have our empty frame. So let's go ahead and drag that in there. And you'll see when I come to my game view and I run this animation, our player just disappears. Exactly how we want it. So now that we have this empty animation, let's go ahead and add it to our weapon and base animators as well. So open this up. Come to our animations folder. Drag in the empty animation. Come to base and do the same thing. Perfect. Now let's set up our transitions, starting with our player. So coming to our player animator, you can see we have the new empty state. I'm just going to drag it up here above idle. Before we can set up the transition, let's go ahead and create the new parameter. So it's going to be a Boolean called attack. Click on entry, make transition to empty. Click on the transition and change the condition to attack is true. Go ahead and move this up to the top. Next, let's create a transition from empty to exit with the same condition. So attack is false in this case. Let's open up the settings, untick has exit time, and set the transition duration to 0. And that's all we need to do in the player animator. Next, we'll start with our base part of our weapon animations. So let's just organize this a little bit. We'll start with empty at the top, followed by sword 1, sword 2, and sword 3. Now, empty is going to be our default state. So we can go ahead and right-click on entry, say set state machine default state, and click on empty. So this means whenever the animator starts, empty is going to be our default state. We don't want the weapon to randomly show up. Now, how do we transition out of empty? Again, let's go ahead and create a new Boolean parameter, and we'll just call it attack, the same as for the player. We'll go ahead and make a transition from empty to exit. Click on it, and the condition is attack must be true. So when attack is true, this is how we know, okay, now we want to go to these 3 animations. Go ahead and untick has exit time and set the transition duration to 0 because we want this transition to happen instantaneously. Next, we can go ahead and make transitions from entry to each one of our attack states. Like that, and each one of their conditions must be attack is true. Then we can go ahead and make transitions from each attack back to exit. In this case, the transition condition is attack must be false. And just don't forget to untick has exit time and set the transition duration to 0. And then do the same for these 2 states as well. Perfect. The question is, how do we know which one of these attack animations we want to go to? We're obviously going to need some sort of counter. So let's go ahead and add a new parameter, and this time it's going to be an int. We'll just call this int attack counter. Like that. So the counter is going to start at 0 and count up, and each number is going to represent one of these attacks. Let's just go ahead and move this up to the top of the list, and let's start with our first animation transition. Go ahead and add a new condition, attack counter, and change this from greater to equals. So if attack counter equals 0, we'll go to the first attack. Come to the second transition, add the condition, change it to equals, and set this to 1. So if attack counter equals 1, the second animation happens. And then do the same thing for the last transition. So add the condition, attack counter equals 2. And that's basically all the transitions we need here for now. Now we can just go ahead and repeat the steps for our weapon game object. So let's just start off by organizing it. And let's go ahead and set empty as our default state. So we can either right click on entry and say set state machine default state and select empty, or you can just click on the state and say set as layer default state. Let's go ahead and add our attack Boolean parameter. And let's set up the transitions. So we have a transition going from empty to exit. Click on that. Untick has exit time. The transition duration is 0. And the condition is attack is true. Now we have a transition going from entry to each one of our animations with the condition that attack must be true. We then have transitions going from each one of the animations to exit with the condition that attack must be false. And don't forget to untick has exit time and set the transition duration to 0. And now finally, we just need to add our attack counter in. So add a new parameter. It's an integer. Call it attack counter. And then click on our first transition. Add our attack counter. And change it from greater to equals 0. And then go to the second transition. Add the attack counter condition. Equals 1. And then the last transition equals 2. Perfect, and there we have all of our animation transitions set up for our sword. Now we can finally take a look at our weapon script. So let's come back to our editor. And let's think about what our weapon script is going to do. Like I mentioned at the start of the video, our weapon script is essentially responsible for defining how our attack state is going to interact with the weapon. What functions do we want to expose to the attack state that the attack state can use to control the weapon? Another thing the weapon is going to be responsible for is just setting up the basic animator parameters that's going to be shared among all weapons. All weapons are going to have that attack boolean, because the attack boolean is basically our entry and exit condition for the whole entire weapon animation structure. So to start off with, let's just get a reference to those two animators. We'll go ahead and create a private animator, and we'll just call it base animator, and then create another private animator called weapon animator. Now we'll go ahead and set these two references in our start function. So let's go ahead and create a protected virtual void start. And the reason we're using protected virtual void is because we already know that there's going to be some scripts that inherit from weapons. So we might as well just expose it to those scripts already, which actually means that our two animators also need to be protected instead of private. In our start function, let's start by saying base animator equals, and now we want to get the animator component. But how are we going to do that? Well, if we look at our game object structure, our script sits on sword1, and the animators live on these two child game objects. So now we can find the animators based on these game object names. We just need to make sure that when we create new weapons, we keep this naming convention consistent. So we can say equals transform.find, and the game object that we want to find is called base. And then from this game object, we want to dot get component, and the component type is animator, just like that. So now we're going to look at our child called base. We're just going to get its animator. We can go ahead and do the same thing for our weapon animator. So weapon animator equals transform.find. We're looking for weapon dot get component of type animator, like that. Now, when are we going to tell our weapon that it's time to start playing its animation? Essentially what's happening is when we attack, we enter the attack state, which basically means that our attack state needs to let our weapon know that, hey, I've been entered and it's time for you to do your thing. So what we're going to do is create a weapon enter function on our weapon class. So just go ahead and create a public virtual void, call it enter weapon. And then in here we can start off by setting up that animator logic. We know that when we enter the weapon, we want to set attack equal to true on both our base animator and our weapon animator. So we'll say base animator dot set bool, and the bool we want to set is attack, and the value we want to set it to is true. And then do the same thing for weapon animator. So weapon animator dot set bool attack equals true. Now, when do we set attack equal to false? Well, that's going to happen when we exit our attack state. The reason it happens when we exit our attack state is because on our player animator, right? If we take a look at that, we're in this empty state, and we transition out of the empty state when attack gets set to false. When does attack get set to false? It gets set to false when we exit the attack state. So in order to sync these things up, our weapon attack exit needs to happen at the same time as our attack state exit. So if we look at this diagram again, our attack state exit function is going to call our weapon exit function. So let's go back to our script and create a public virtual void exit weapon. So what are we going to do in here? Well, basically the exact same as we did in enter, except this time it's going to be false. Like that. Now, one more little thing that we can do just for performance is when we're not using the weapon, we don't need it to be active. Otherwise, you know, the weapon animator is just doing a bunch of stuff in the background that doesn't really mean anything. It's in an empty frame anyway, so you don't see anything. We might as well just disable the whole game object completely. So in start, after getting our animators, let's go ahead and say game object.setActive equal to false. And then in our enter weapon function, before we set our booleans, this is important, we go ahead and say GameObject.setActive back to true. And then in exit, after setting the booleans, we go ahead and say GameObject.setActive equal to false. Perfect, so that's the basics of our weapon class setup. Let's go ahead and set up the interactions with our player attack state. We haven't done anything in here yet. So in our player attack state, we know we're going to need our enter and exit functions because we need them to call the weapon enter and exit functions. So let's start off with public override void, and we'll just call the enter function, and then public override void exit. Now, in order to call the enter weapon and exit weapon functions, we need a reference to our weapon. So in our player attack state, let's go ahead and declare a private weapon that we just call weapon. And this means now in our enter function, we can go ahead and say weapon.enterWeapon. And in the exit function, we can say weapon.exitWeapon. Now the question becomes, where does the reference to this weapon come from? And in order to set this up, we're going to create a very temporary inventory script that we're going to use just for testing. It's a very simple script, but it'll just set the groundwork for what we're going to be doing later. Before we create that script though, let's just go ahead and create another function in our player attack state that is responsible for setting the weapon. So we'll create a public void set weapon. And the input parameter for this function just needs to be of type weapon, called weapon. And all this function does is just this dot weapon equals weapon. So when we call this function, we set our weapon reference for this state. Now let's just go back to Unity real quick. And let's come to our player's script folder. And let's go ahead and create a new C# script. We'll just call this player inventory. Like I said, the script is going to be very temporary. It's mainly just for testing. Let's go ahead and open that up. We can go ahead and get rid of all this code. And all this script is going to have is a public weapon array called weapons. Let's go ahead and come back to Unity and click on our player. And let's just drag this script on here. So, boop. Now our player has a very rudimentary inventory. Over here you see our weapons array, currently of size 0. If we go ahead and change that to 1, we can go ahead and drag our sword in here. So now we're going to reference this player inventory script in order to set our weapon on our state. To do this, let's go ahead and come back to our player script over here. And let's come to our components region and create a variable for our inventory. So public player inventory, and we'll just call it inventory. Give this a public getter and a private setter, like that. And then in our start function, all we need to say is inventory equals get component of type player inventory. So now we have a reference to our player inventory in our player script, meaning we can access the weapons that it contains. So now before we initialize our state machine to our idle state, let's just go ahead and say primary attack state dot set weapon, and the weapon we want to set it to is the first weapon in that array. So we'll just go ahead and say inventory dot weapons, and then open up some square brackets, and which index do we want to use? Well, we want to use combat inputs dot primary, and don't forget to cast that as an int. Now eventually, once we make a second weapon, we can do the same thing for our secondary attack state. So let's just go ahead and copy and paste this and change this to secondary attack state. So now both these attack states are going to reference the same weapon, but that's okay for now. So I think we're actually ready to test it. Let's go ahead and go back to Unity, and let's save, and let's run the game. So you'll see if we left click, perfect, the animation starts. You could see that it was seamless. There was no gaps where there suddenly wasn't a sprite and then there was again, but we have a very obvious issue, and that is that we're stuck in our attack animation. But everything is working as it should so far. So how are we going to get out of that loop? Well, the same way we get out of all of our other animations, and that is with a animation finish trigger. So how is this going to work? Well, to start off, let's come to our player attack state. Let's just go ahead and create a region for our animation triggers. And then inside of this, we'll start off with our animation finish trigger. So we have a public void animation finish trigger. And this actually needs to be a public override void animation finish trigger with base.animation finish trigger inside. So when our attack animation finishes, we want to let our state know that we're finished. That way our attack state can let our player ability state know that the ability is done. So all we need to do in here is just say is ability done equals true. But how are we going to call this function? Well, we're going to call this function from our weapon. So let's go ahead and come to our weapon script and let's do the same thing. We're going to create another region for our animation triggers. And in here, let's create a public virtual void called animation finish trigger. Now, in this function, we want to call our attack state's animation finish trigger function, which means that our weapon is going to need a reference to our attack state. To do this, let's just come up to our variables and create a protected player attack state, and we'll just call it state. We can then come to our animation finish trigger function and just say state dot animation finish trigger, like that. But now how are we going to set this state reference? We're going to set it by creating an initialized weapon function that gets called by our state whenever the state gets assigned this specific weapon. So outside of this region, let's just go ahead and create a public initialize weapon. And this initialize weapon function is going to have a player attack state input parameter just called state. And this needs to be public void, not just public. Inside this function, we can then go ahead and say this.state equals state, like that. Let's come back to our player attack state, and over here in our set weapon function, let's just go ahead and call weapon.initialize weapon, and it wants a player attack state, which is the state that we're currently in, so we'll just pass in this. So this now means that our weapon has the ability to tell our state when the animation is finished. So now all we need to do is call the trigger, our animation finish trigger, from the actual animation. But here's where we run into one more issue. Our weapon script is on the sword game object, but our animations are on the child game objects. And if we add an animation event here, they can't call functions on their parent game objects. So what do? Well, we've dealt with something like this before. If we go ahead and look at our scripts folder, you'll see over here we have the script called animation to state machine. This is basically what I'm calling an intermediary script. Its only purpose is to relay messages from one script to another based on a certain configuration. So we're just going to make another one of these. So let's go ahead and create a new folder, and I'm just going to call it intermediaries, like that. And let's go ahead and drag this animation to state machine script in there just for organization. And let's open it up. And in here, we'll go ahead and create a new C# script, and we'll just call it weapon animation to weapon, like that. If we go ahead and open that up, basically all that we're going to do in here is create all the triggers that we have on weapon, and then have a reference to our weapon, and from those triggers call the triggers on the weapon. I hope that makes sense. It's pretty simple. So we'll start off by just creating a private weapon called weapon. So this is going to be a reference to the weapon that we want to communicate with, and we can set this reference in our start function. So start, and in here we just say weapon equals get component, but this script is going to sit on the child of the actual weapon script. So instead of get component, we're going to use get component in parent, like that. The component that we're looking for is our weapon script. So this getComponentImpaired function starts on the game object that this is attached to and then looks for this component. If it doesn't find it, it goes to the direct parent and looks there and keeps going up the list until it gets to the root component or the root game object. But in this case, weapon should be on the direct parent, so that's all we need. Let's start off by adding our private void animation finish trigger. And in here, all we need to do is say weapon dot animation finish trigger, like that. What we can do now is come back to Unity and come and click on our base child game object, and on here add our weapon animation to weapon script. So what this is going to allow us to do now is, if we take a look at our animations, if we come to the end and add an animation event, come over here to function, over here we have this animation finish trigger function. This is the function on our intermediary. It's not on our weapon script. But we can go ahead and select that, and now our animation will let our weapon know when it's finished. Let's go ahead and add that to all of our animations. Like that. But just note that we don't need to add this to our weapon animations, just to our base animations. And let's go ahead and test it out. It should work now.
One eternity later.
Okay, so it turns out I'm a real big goof and made a pretty big mistake that cost me like 20 minutes of headache. But yeah, we can't set primary and secondary attack states to the same weapon. So let's just go ahead and comment out secondary attack state because that's giving us some issues. So if we go ahead and test it out with our animation events added in now, there we go. When the animation finishes, you can see that it stops. Now, as you can see, there is a little graphical glitch there sometimes. You can see the sword just pop up there sometimes. Now, to fix this, all we need to do is come to our animations, come to combat, base, sword, and for each one of these animations, untick loop time. Now, unfortunately, for some reason, Unity does not allow us to select all of them and change it, so we have to go through and do it one by one. So it's a good idea to start doing this as soon as you create the animations, just so you don't have too many to do at one time. Okay, so we've done base, let's go to weapon, boop, 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 and that'll stop that little glitch. Smooth. Cool, so we basically now have the ability to change between different animators and player attack animation, and we have the ability to communicate between our attack state and our weapon, and having the weapon let the state know when the animation is done so that it can react accordingly. Now, I think that is where I'm going to leave it for today's episode. There's still a lot that we need to do. Next, we're going to look at the attack counter and how we're going to implement that and start adding movement to our attacks as well. Okay, so I hope you guys found that really interesting. I'm so excited about this. I'm really proud of this system, and I can't wait to show you guys how the rest of it works. I'm sorry if we didn't make a lot of progress in this episode, but it's a pretty big system, and we're going to need time to wrap our heads around it, and I don't want to rush it. I want to go ahead and try and explain things as well and as properly as I can. So now, before I go, I would just like to give a huge thank you to all of my Patreon supporters and wonderful people. You guys are amazing, and you guys really encourage me to keep doing what I do. And then I would also just like to give a huge special thank you to all of the absolute mad lads, and that is Borgia, MK Ultra, Simon, Clean Vassner, Jeremiah Miranda, Binary Chef SA, Cody Lee, and Pyro Says. Thank you guys so much for your support. It means so much. And yeah, I'll see you guys in the next episode. I hope you guys all have a wonderful day.